So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for today's Edge webinar, Ransomware Readiness Checklist, Preparation for an Attack. I'm Adam Scarzafava, AVP for Marketing and Communications here at Edge. And for those who might not be as familiar with us as an organization, I'll give you just a quick 10,000-foot view of who Edge is and what we do and why we've brought people together here today before we dive into the rest of the day's content. So Edge is a nonprofit, member-based research and education network and a technology partner. We're formed by the Higher Education President's Council here in New Jersey. Back around the turn of the century, they realized that they needed to create a partner to really serve on their behalf as the digital world evolved and progressed, and Edge was formed to do that. In the years since, we've grown and really expanded that mission in addition to higher ed, serving the K-12 space, state and local government, any other healthcare, any other kind of nonprofit, public serving entity. Edge is there to help craft technology strategy and hopefully help those organizations succeed through the use of technology. How do we do that? Well, initially, what that meant was building a network around the state of New Jersey. We still own and operate EdgeNet. That's a purpose-built optical fiber network that really is purpose-built for the higher ed community, but has lots of benefits for K-12s and healthcares as well. That network has grown to have points of presence in Pennsylvania and New York City, and we're continuing to plan expansions there. Edge Discovery is a really exciting kind of emerging piece of what Edge does, really helping to accelerate research and discovery through technology. Edge Market obviously is key, helping set up ways that our members and education institutions and public institutions across the country can quickly and easily and safely procure technology solutions that are really vital to their missions. Events networking and community building, just like what we're doing here today. And then thought leadership and solution development, really looking, as you can see there, for the niches where Edge can provide a lot of value and provide services, people, and leadership that can accelerate what your institutions are doing in areas where it's maybe a challenge to do that yourselves. One of which is in cybersecurity. We know how hard it is to kind of identify, onboard, and keep cybersecurity talent, folks to really run those operations. And so one of the things that Edge has really invested lots of time and lots of energy in is connecting our members with solutions that answer the bill on the cybersecurity front. One of the ways we do that is by offering kind of shared services access to a virtual chief information security officer. So with that, I think that's a perfect place to kind of segue and invite Dr. Don Dockery to jump in and really get into the meat of today's session. So Don, I'll stop sharing my screen. You can share yours and we're off and running. And I think you're still muted.
Well, that's embarrassing. So anyway, here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so Don Dockery, I do function as the virtual chief information security officer for Edge. Glad to see some of my favorites on the call today. Really excited about this particular topic because I think it's so important and so relevant. So glad to see everybody on to talk about this. So a little bit of my background: 15 years roughly working for and with the Department of Defense in the U.S. My PhD is roughly in the cybersecurity space, focused on the success and measurement of cybersecurity operations within an organization. So, how are we doing in cybersecurity? What is our maturity? How do we rate and rack and stack against other folks? So really glad to bring all of that to bear and help everybody in this space. It's just such a really fulfilling and wonderful, organization to work within. So the ransomware readiness checklist, preparation for an attack. So we all know that ransomware is such a huge and growing problem, not only for us, but it's affecting us in a number of ways that we're going to talk about today in depth. So understanding how ransomware affects us from a technical perspective, from a financial perspective, and then in long term, from an insurance perspective. So I suspect some or many of you may have been involved with our insurance webinar that we had previously. If you haven't, I'm sure Adam can hook you up with that link as well. But talking about how all of this affects us holistically as organizations from a current perspective, from a near and far term perspective of being ready writ large, but in this particular case, ransomware. We're going to talk about that. So we can't start by assuming anything. So what is ransomware? So we've all heard about viruses and malware for years and years. To give the anecdote, so my first job I was actually in college, was for Dell Computers. And I was working the help desk at Dell whenever the Anacornicova virus actually came through. And one of the first ones, just, it's, a picture of Anacornicova, and we have, we're then, giving malware out to the larger community. And I remember calling my mom at the time and just saying, hey, don't click this email, because I knew her well enough to know she would click anything. If it said this is a virus, she probably would have opened it. So we've moved from those kind of situations into ransomware, which is distributed very much in the same way. So it's very much still and by the way, if you see something off to the side or walking behind me, that is the cat. I tried to lock him out of the room, and he just was going to yell in the back at the door. So I figured, you guys get a little bit of entertainment walking back and forth through the room. So ransomware is processed and moved through the system in very much the same way. So the human vector, having the phishing emails, having websites that have been compromised, those same types of vectors are still in play here, just as it was back when my mom was going to be a target for that Anacornicova virus. We're still thinking about the human vector here. But if you look on the screen, the numbers are just going up exponentially. And if you happen to be involved in our insurance call that we had several months ago, the problem is the ransomware threat is going up, but the insurance situation is really locking down tight about, okay, they're paying more money out. Okay, we're going to make this more of a problem for the schools and the organizations to deal with. In 2021, education was the most targeted segment of, all of the kind of verticals to deal with. And what I'm seeing here, actually personally, and I think this is a trend across the field writ large, not only are we having to worry about dealing with the ransomware situation. So we have the ransom, we're dealing with the pain of the ransom, but now we're also dealing with a data breach situation. So we're seeing more variants of ransomware starting to actually go in, actually exfiltrate the data out of the organization, and then hold the organization for ransom, and then sell the data on the dark web or otherwise. So what we're seeing is you get two pains. You get the pain of having to deal with ransom. Should we pay? Should we not? How do we clean up from this situation? And then, okay, then my data was, exfiltrated. How do I deal with that as well? So, just pain all around. And, it's not going away. So what do we do about it? How do we get after it? So, to keep pounding on the subject, average cost per incident, $2.7 million. So that's going to cost, let's talk about what a cost of a ransomware incident ends up being. So it's not just paying the ransom. You may not even pay the ransom. The cost of a ransomware incident ends up being maybe ransom, maybe not, but it's going to end up being the personnel cost. So let's talk about that. Personnel costs for a ransomware incident could be everything from the overtime of the personnel you already have, perhaps paying to supplement or bring on contractors or outsource some teams to come in and help. You also have, a hardware cost. So maybe you just can't restore your systems. You have to bring in more hardware, more software, perhaps, maybe you didn't have the right controls in place. Maybe you need to bring in some more endpoint response and detection services to help you clean the situation up. Down to things like a notification situation. So do we have to notify people in a data breach situation? We find out that the particular variant that we have has caused a data breach. So do we have to notify the people who were affected? That could end up being, quite frankly, paying people to stuff envelopes, paying people to pull data on the addresses. How do we notify? Do we need to set up a call center? Those kind of things absolutely will go towards that $2.7 million. So there are a lot of hidden costs that we have not necessarily historically thought about. But let me also say there are hidden costs such as reputation. So if you are an institution that is looking to, quite frankly, be a cybersecurity oriented organization, maybe you're a higher ed that has a cybersecurity program, a data breach, a ransomware attack might cause you some reputational loss. Or you're just a general institution that, you think about what, someone making a choice between you or someone else. Reputation is actually key, and it's hard to put a dollar amount on, but it does end up being a loss that we have a hard time quantifying, but it is definitely there. So you see all the things on the slide. I won't belabor them, but I just will say, when you're there, the 35% of the organizations paid a ransom, and then the average ransom was $112,000. So when you look back up to that 2.7 million, you think, well, good grief, that's a discrepancy. But the difference is, what could have been paid ahead of time in prevention, and then got paid on the back end in response. I think the old saying is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we're going to talk a good bit about the prevention aspect of this. So if you were involved in the insurance discussion, this is not new to you, but this is a little bit of updated data. So we have been tracking very closely the insurance providers that are kind of the largest insurance providers in the market. And we're doing good analysis on the applications that are coming in. So understanding what are they asking for? What are the things they're worried about? Because at the end of the day, these are things that are going to affect your cost and your coverage. So we are looking for those at Edge, trying to understand what are the things that they're asking for, what is affecting your cost and coverage, and how can we kind of help yourselves with those things. So we had our last webinar on that. We did the analysis in June of 2021. I can't believe it's been that long. Good grief. But we looked at the applications for 5 of the major insurers. And at that point in time, where they were asking about controls, asking about, the critical things that need to be locked down, and we'll talk about a lot of those in a minute. But they're not at that point in time necessarily specifically asking about what do you plan to do about ransomware? What is the plan for dealing with that? We've seen a sharp transition in the last few months. So you see on the right, applications are increasingly asking about how do you plan to deal with ransomware? Have you had the ransomware situation? Do you have policies and procedures associated with that? And the controls are increasingly focused around those things. So we're seeing, quite frankly, a need, an increased focus on, from an insurance perspective, as we've continued since the last time we looked at it, to do the analysis to figure out how do we get ahead of this for everyone's benefit. And so, believe it or not, this is the last slide. So we're going to talk in depth about these things. So the Department of Homeland Security, alongside of the critical security controls, so there are 18 of them at this point in time in version 8.1, as well as the NIST 800-53. We've taken those and we've really started to try to think about how do we understand and best assess the readiness of an organization for ransomware attacks. So it's readiness to prevent ransomware from happening, and then if it does happen, how do we mitigate that effect? So get you back up and running as soon as possible. So talking through kind of these different control sets, web browser management and DNS filtering. So on the right, you'll see example solutions. Cisco Umbrella is a great one. So DNS filtering, Cisco Umbrella does a great job with that. Web browser management, understanding, quite frankly, a lot of us out here are Chrome users. So, but even if you're not, how do we manage the settings on our web browsers? How to make sure that people aren't adding things in, adding extensions in, understanding the Google App Store and making sure things aren't being added into the web browser that might create risk to the organization. Phishing prevention and awareness. Now, listen, I could talk for hours on this particular thing. So phishing tests and awareness for the organization. So understanding the phishing test environment. We need to be doing phishing tests across the organization, period. At least monthly, if you can, quarterly, if there's a situation where we're bringing people along, getting people involved and engaged, and having them understand the risk. How do we understand at best the posture and how people are responding to phishing attacks if we don't test them. And then how do we train them? It's a really cyclical, iterative process. How do we test them and then train them? KnowBe4 is a great example of a platform that does help with that. They have both of that built in, but writ large, no matter what platform you use, and there are a lot of good ones out there, we need to be testing. We need to be training our people to, act better. We talked in the beginning of the situation, in the beginning of the webinar, about the human is the key to this. So making sure that we've trained people and then we're testing them, and it's an iterative process. It's never going to be done. We got to make sure that they are aware and engaged in their role in the organization. And I say their role, that's a really important part of it as well. Your basic users, your students even, are not going to be as critical as your human resources, as your payroll, and they need to be trained as such. So giving the right amount of training and the right amount of testing for those people is really critical. Network perimeter monitoring, that's a large and a really interesting category in and of itself. So Fortinet, I put in there because, quite frankly, if you have a firewall and you're monitoring it and checking the inputs and the outputs, the traffic in and out, in and of itself is a great network perimeter monitoring solution if you have the right people who can, quite frankly, take that information and make sense of it. We have some solutions also at Edge to do a larger network traffic analysis, but quite frankly, these are the things people need to be looking at: what's coming in and what's coming out of the network, and understanding, are we talking to people we shouldn't be? Are we connecting to sites? Are we going to the dark web? Are we going to known bad malware hubs? We need to understand those things. So there are a lot of perimeter tools that will do that. And so that has been identified as a critical ransomware control. Asset management. So do you know, quite frankly, what is on your network from a hardware and a software perspective? So Manage Engine, the service desk function, I just threw that out there because, quite frankly, it's one of my favorites. Something that is on the actual host level, where we can see what's supposed to be on the network and what is not supposed to be on the network from a client perspective. What are the patch? We're talking about patch management and then application integrity, but these all go together. What is supposed to be on the network and what shouldn't be on the network and needs to be kicked out. This can be done from a physical perspective, but actually, as we've moved much more broadly into the work at home environment, a much more telework environment, understanding how we manage the things that are supposed to be on the network from a hardware perspective, managing who's supposed to be connecting through VPN. And then, quite frankly, from a software perspective. So do we know what is a authorized, valid piece of software? I want to talk a little bit about vendor management here for a second. So installing pieces of software on the network has been in the past just, almost a shadow IT situation. So as we get our security together, as we understand how we get ahead of the threat, we have to start understanding vendor management and getting the software together and understanding what is valid on the network, what is approved and authorized and what is not. And then, holding people accountable as such. So that's a larger part of asset management, understanding hardware and software and understanding the risk that unauthorized hardware and software bring to the network. So Manage Engine has the service desk approach, a great one, but there are definitely others that are out there doing great work. I touched on this already a little bit, but patch and update management. So vulnerabilities are occurring on a weekly, definitely monthly basis. Vulnerabilities are occurring regularly, but patching them does appear to be, mostly cyclical from a software perspective, for sure. So how are we getting ahead of the patch management? Understanding the critical systems. So have you identified the most critical systems on your network and how many days it will take you to patch those systems? So quite frankly, the bare minimum of the most critical systems that you should be looking at from this framework is 15 days. So that's a, receive, patch, test, and deploy situation for the most critical systems and the top tier patches, 30 days at most for everything else. So how do you do that? How do you understand what that looks like and how to manage that situation? We like the Qualys. We have the health check program with Edge. Really, we send out vulnerability scans at least once a month for the health check clients. But really, quite frankly, what's important here is getting ahead of that patch management process. Understand your vulnerabilities from the public perspective, most important, down to the internal, good to have, nice to have. So work those down with a prioritized manner, and Qualys is a good tool to do that in our esteem. User and access management, super important from a ransomware perspective. So we have had outbreaks of ransomware that were saved, absolutely saved the network and the ability to conduct business, because those the IT team had done a good job at putting the appropriate segmentation and segregation in place. So making sure that you segment and segregate the systems, the critical systems, away from, maybe your student VLAN, or keeping things really segregated. It does create a management issue, I won't lie, but making sure that you keep things separate, it keeps, quite frankly, the ransomware from being able to move across the network in a way that spreads the badness around. So I put Okta in here just, quite frankly, because this is a great time to talk about multi-factor authentication. So many of these problems we've talked about previously would just be more well-suited if they had good multi-factor authentication. So strong passwords are great, but multi-factor is even better. So Okta is a great example of how that can work. There are also some great options. Duo is a good one. I use, quite regularly, and it's a good option as well. But even if you just use the basic Microsoft or Google authentication, put that multi-factor in. It is just, it's important, it's necessary. And by the way, going back to the insurance discussion, it is the most important thing that they're looking for, quite frankly, is the two-factor or multi-factor authentication within a network. Finally, on the best practices to prevent ransomware, the cat, is application integrity and allow lists. So how do we blacklist and whitelist? We talked about a little bit previously, but making sure how applications can run on the network. AppLocker is, a great example of this within Microsoft Windows. How do we set things up appropriately where applications can and cannot run? It's very difficult in an enterprise environment, I won't lie. And I know it to be the case, but how do we set it up where at least we blacklist bad applications that we know are coming through? And there's some great free resources that can tell us what needs to be blocked, what are the things that need to be blocked from an application perspective. So putting those things into place that allow us to maintain application integrity, understanding, again, to get back to the asset management perspective, what hardware and what software that we have that is known good and valid to be run. So those are the best practices to prevent incidents. So let me take a drink.
While we're on a quick break, Dawn, if I can jump in, we do have a question came over in the chat.
Okay.
How often is or have Linux systems had ransomware attacks, to your knowledge? Is there any data or anything available on that?
I'll be frank with you. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I would anticipate. Glad to come back with an answer on that, but I anticipate much less. So in my estimation, Linux is going to be less than is going to be Apple Macintosh, is going to be Windows. Because if you think about it, ransomware, they want to deploy that in a place that is going to make them the most money. And the user base for Linux is just not, it's going to be a more of server situation and less of a widespread user base situation. So I don't believe it is as prevalent, but it is definitely out there for sure.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Go ahead if you want to hit me with some others.
I think that was the first one I saw in the chat for now. So keep them coming, and we'll make sure we get to them as we go here. But all yours. Okay.
So we'll talk quickly about mitigating the severity of a ransomware incident. So what do you do? The big thing is data backup. Oh my goodness, I cannot express this more strongly about a good set of backups. And I will tell you, not only backing up, so AWS is obviously a solution there, but having something offline. So I want you to think about how ransomware propagates through a network. We talked about segmentation and segregation. So how ransomware moves through a network looking like a worm for places to go. They're going to immediately go to that data backup. They're looking for it. They're trying to mess up your backup. So even if you do it on, even just a regular basis, something that you have offline is going to just, help you sleep better at night, help me sleep better at night. The worst case scenario is you drop back to your offline backup, and it's a good news story, not a great news story if if you're a month behind, but it's better than nothing. It's a really important thing to think about, having that offline backup. Now we get into the bread and butter situation: incident response planning, risk management. So as a virtual CISO, part of my job is to get people ready for this situation. So we've had the situations happen. We've learned the lessons. That is part of the the goodness that the virtual CISO service does bring to you, is the best practices, the lessons learned from the previous experiences we've had. And one of those is bringing you a incident response plan that has been tested, battle hardened. We've walked through it, sadly, in real time, in a response, and bringing that to bear for you. So that, as well as the testing aspect. So an incident response plan is just paper until it is actually tested on a regular basis with your team. The testing aspect is critical, both from an incident response and a disaster recovery perspective. How do you know something's going to work or not? You don't necessarily, nothing's 100%, but you do want your team to know, in a time of crisis, this is what I'm supposed to do. People in crisis don't necessarily react positively. They sometimes really do look for, they quite frankly freak out. So having things tested, having them in writing, I prefer anybody on the call who's gone through this with me knows I love a flow chart, because quite frankly, in a time of crisis, something bad's going on. Let's go through the flow. We don't need to read the plan. We're going to walk through the flow chart. We're going to, execute the flow chart appropriately. So we really believe in the planning and in the testing aspects of this. So that's a huge one. Does everyone, to include your legal counsel and your board, do they know their roles and responsibility? Who's going to communicate? How are things going to be communicated to the larger, your parents and your faculty and staff? How are things going to be communicated? If you don't have access to your normal methods like email, how are we going to do that? So those are the kind of things we're talking about with incident response planning and testing. Risk management. I will just say, so any of you who happen to be on the call and are, responsible for Graham Leach Bliley, risk management should be actually a real concern for you at this point in time, because there are a lot of new requirements coming down. 100%. Adam and I were just talking about this. An unbelievable amount of requirements coming through from a penetration testing perspective, a vulnerability assessment perspective. But one of the most important ones, the fundamental ones, is, do you have a single point of contact who, quite frankly, is responsible for your information security, your cybersecurity program? You have to have a name on the line. Like, who is that going to be? And so, what is, from a risk management perspective, who's looking at your business impact analysis? Who's understanding your risk register? All these things that come in from a risk management, those are all critical functions that, understanding the impact to your organization if you have a ransomware attack. So from a virtual CISO perspective, we do work on that as well, trying to get you to that point where you can say, and articulate that information eloquently. This is what we look like today. This is where we're going. Here's our path, our work plan to that. And then, especially for the higher ed, clients, are we meeting the requirements that are emerging every day, for things like GLBA? So, and then finally, to give some time back to comments, risk transference, makes perfect sense. We talked about insurance. Again, I've mentioned several times the webinar we had done previously, but there is a certain amount that does end up, quite frankly, being an insurance requirement, a transference of risk to a third party. And so are we ready to do that? Do we have the things in place, the controls in place to prepare to get the best, coverage and costs from a insurance perspective? So a lot of these things that we've really discussed are playing into that. But I will say, as the virtual CISO, being prepared to talk to the insurance company, being prepared to bring your case to the table and understand fundamentally, where are you? Everyone on this call should know where they are from a visibility perspective. Where are you on all these things when they bring that to the table? How are you approaching all these things? What do you look like? And that's the transference perspective. Getting the best deal, getting the best cost and the best coverage, and being sure that you understand what risk are you going to be able to transfer, and quite frankly, what are you responsible for in an insurance perspective if the worst happens. So there you go. I think I've talked enough. So Adam, any further questions, comments?
Yeah, we had a few come in off to the side. So what checklist items besides MFA have the biggest impact on cybersecurity insurance costs?
Oh, okay. So we did a webinar on this. So that's a great question. So I would tell you, people, process, technology. So think about it in that framework. So technology, your MFA is going to be absolutely fundamental. Your incident response planning and testing, absolutely fundamental. Your training and awareness program, absolutely fundamental. So if I were to go to anyone and say, what are the top things you need to do? MFA, phishing testing, awareness training, and incident response planning. Those are the three things.
Cool, thanks. I think that's a good segue to one of the other questions we got in on security awareness. So how often should we be training and testing? And how can testing be kept current with the latest ransomware?
Okay, so that's a great question. So listen, I understand the education context and the challenges that come along with it. So at a bare minimum, we need to have training annually. And I will tell you what we're going to need to do: onboarding training that is signed off on, so they understand acceptable use, and they've completed the training before they receive accounts. That's a big stretch for some folks, but it's absolutely what needs to happen. So onboarding at that point in time, annual training afterwards. Again, my requirement would be annual training with signing the annual acceptable use policy annually. I would recommend no less than quarterly phishing testing. Some of my real superstars out there are doing them every other week, so every 2 weeks, and that's about right. Just rolling phishing tests, so we can truly understand what is actually the current posture of the personnel. What are they doing? Like, what are they clicking on? And the testing, by the way, we have the ability in things like KnowBe4, in the platforms like that we can actually take a look and find real current issues. So I will pick on T-Mobile for a second. One of the schools I work with, we did a T-Mobile test. I think about a week or so after T-Mobile had a big breach and they announced it. So we did a test using a T-Mobile template inside of KnowBe4. And why that matters is it's a real world current situation. It's really going to test the the user's ability to discern between this is a phishing email and, oh, this actually just happened, I saw it in the news. Another good example of how we do that is on holidays. So we just had Valentine's Day yesterday. You can send Valentine's phishing emails. It sounds almost a little bit cruel, but we're trying to teach people to not, to really be discerning. Please understand, this is what a fisher, this is what a hacker is going to do. So be aware, be alert. So I would say, long-winded to get back to the question, the more the merrier on both of those things. But on training, if we're going to be realistic, at least annually. Love to see messages go out more often on current threat, but also testing phishing tests at least quarterly, and preferably monthly, if I could say that.
Have you seen any? I know there's been a lot, of ransomware trying to kind of seed the ground with messages that go out around, COVID policy or this or that, and click a link there. Have you seen any of that that's either particularly well hidden or worrisome?
Yes.
Or have you seen any good training on that stuff?
Yes, there is good training on that, but I will tell you, here's the big kind of message on that. You used to be able to pick out a spam message, and sometimes you still can pick out a spam message about the content and the quality of the message. You can't do that anymore. They're well written. They figured out, they've heard the jokes and, about how things used to be written, and you can pick out a spam message. You can't do that anymore. You have to be looking for the content keys. So do people understand how to mouse over a link and see that it's not a legitimate link? Do they understand things like, messages that are trying to get, urgency out of someone and trying to get, information out of someone? Do they understand kind of the keys and the things to be looking for? So we have to get, away from, the looking at the quality of the message and actually understanding what should we look for in a message. Pick up the phone and call somebody. If it came from your, supervisor and it has a sense of urgency, hey, get out there and pay this invoice. We actually need to pick up the phone and call, because or walk down the hallway and figure it out. So, and in a work from home environment, in a remote environment, certainly that is a more important than ever. Just pick up the phone and call.
Got to get back to the old school way of doing business.
Yep, absolutely.
I think we can grab another question out of the chat here that just popped in. Regarding telling your story to insurance carriers, outside of insurance apps that are yes/no questions, would Edge have a sample document with narrative to model, or is there any guidance you can give there on kind of telling that story and building the case to insurance carriers?
So we do have some options, not necessarily a document, although Adam and I can talk about it later. But telling your story ends up being, quite frankly, coming to the table with data. So to tell an anecdote about a situation I had with a school that we work with. So we came to the table, having an update, looking for a renewal of the insurance policy. The carrier came with a document that said, you have these ports open, you have these things running, it's unacceptable. That's not, we're going to raise your rates as a result of these things you have in place. But what was incredibly critical, I'm so glad I was there for that, is that as a virtual CISO, they had brought me into the meeting. And this particular client also had the health check program. So we had vulnerability scanning going on regularly, and I was their, CISO. So I knew that what the insurance company was bringing to the table was not legitimate. It was not the case. It was not the current posture. And so when we pushed back and said, I don't think that's actually the case. I can show you here. Let me pull up the latest scan. That port's not open. In fact, I was actually feverishly running current scans while this was going on, because I just, we're on trying to get the most current, the freshest data on the call. And what ended up happening, quite frankly, I'll be honest, is they said, no, don't worry about it. That was from a third-party contractor they had brought in to come and assess the posture. They didn't have a good idea of what we had going on. They actually didn't understand the footprint of the network and what we looked like. And it just was a real discrepancy between reality and what they had seen. So bringing fresh, actual data to the table made a huge difference in that situation. So I will tell you, there's not necessarily a script, because every school is different. All your controls are different. How you implemented them are different. But what is critical is, can you bring the data to the table when they come and say, this is what you look like? Can you answer that question of, no, that's not what I look like. I actually look like this. Or I understand I have these flaws, and this is my work plan to get ahead of that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Cool. So time for probably one or two more questions. And I think this dovetails nicely with that piece about having the work plan and, knowing what you need to improve on. Of this checklist, what would be the highest priority or most important items you think to deal with first? And lots of people have these at varying stages and sophistication, but what would you go back and check or double check or triple check first here?
Again, incident response, multi-factor, and training. Those are the three. I mean, it's hard to say. These are like pick your favorite child.
And they all work together and intersect, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Because you're trying to deal with people, process, and technology. Again, I don't want to leave out patch management. We've had, actually just today, like, everybody patch your Chrome, go and update your Chrome right now. And if you haven't, update all your Apple devices too, because they've had a big 0 day recently. So, but that being said, multi-factor, understanding your people and their training and phishing perspective, and in the worst situation, how would you deal with an incident? Do you have good backups? Do you have offline backups? Does everybody know what they need to do? Mm-hmm. I'm always going to go back to that.
Cool. So I think probably the last one we'll have here, unless anybody sneaks one in to the chat or Q&A before the end. And I think it works nicely with the point about patch management and stuff. What are the most critical or the most targeted systems that you've seen? Where should members be paying the most attention?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question in and of itself. So we had a ransomware situation a while back, and I haven't seen who's on the call. So if you're on the call and this anecdote because it happened to you, then well done. So we had a situation a while back where a set of schools were targeted with ransomware, and it was a very good news story. And I will just say that the ransomware, luckily, did not get anywhere. Didn't knock on wood. Didn't get anywhere that we've been tracking. But the good news story about it was the school had implemented segregation and segmentation, and thank goodness for that, because the ransomware was actively looking for their student information system.
Mm.
So that's my point on that, quite frankly, is that these ransomware actors are actively deploying ransomware, looking for your learning management and student information systems. They know what you're using. They're actively trying to exploit them, and you have to, you have to understand, if that's your key terrain, that's your most critical asset available, you need to be aware of that, and that's where the segmentation comes in. So they had done a good job at that, and luckily the ransomware fizzled out. It was looking for it, it couldn't connect to it, it didn't have the access rights, and it died on the vine. So a very good news story there. So your student information, always most important.
Well, great. Good to wrap up on a positive story and a win in the face of ransomware, I guess. So I
Definitely.
think that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks so much, Dawn, for the time. Of course, if anybody on the call has any questions about digging into what this all means for your environment specifically, let us know at Edge, and we'll get you connected with Dawn to really kind of get into the weeds and figure out what we can do to help. And again, all from that kind of nonprofit mission driven perspective. That's why we're here. We're here to help you guys all day, every day. So thanks so much for spending time with us. Thanks again, Dawn, for your time. I'll send out the recording from this session and the insurance session, as a few people have requested that. And other than that, have a great day, everybody. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.